I'm Ed Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. If you've listened to the podcast longer than a few weeks, you know that I love history. I love my family too, but it's the history that keeps me working on genealogy. It's an interesting lens through which to understand history at large. Coming through school, we get the perspectives of the founding fathers, the great change makers in history, mostly positive, but with the occasional villain thrown into the mix. But that's not the way that we experience life today that will be known by our descendants as their history. Unless Joe Biden or Elon Musk or perhaps Vladimir Putin are listening to the podcast, you are experiencing life from the perspective of a regular, plain Jane human being. The kind of person who may not even fully understand the wide-scale ramifications of the events that are happening around them. The kind of person who's just trying to get by. And I'm not trying to beat you up or anything, that's me too. Most days I'm just doing everything I can to get to bedtime with my family and job still intact. But as I started to get into my family history, and as I started to vicariously experience major world events from that same little man perspective, it was really fascinating to me. Like I've said before, it's almost like sometimes these major events get muted by smaller, more intimate, and more individually impactful events, and I'm left wondering how I didn't know about them before. The last time I did an episode like this, I talked about the Brownsville Affray in 1906. I don't think I really did it all that much justice. There's just so much more to say, and it's not really the format of the podcast. I just felt like if I didn't talk about it at least a little bit, I was going to pop. Likewise, this week, I want to talk about an event that I was absolutely unaware of until I got into my family history. Once I discovered this event, I just couldn't let it go. It seemed so incredibly important, and so few people seemed to show interest in it. I ultimately ended up consuming a large part of my year as it became a third of what ultimately formed into my master's thesis. But enough intro, here's the hook. Have you ever been stuck in a bureaucratic nightmare that you just felt like you couldn't get out of? Maybe it's something small, like your cell phone company is billing you for international phone calls that you're not making. You try calling, but all you get is a customer service AI system that doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand your complaint. You try asking to speak to a human, so it puts you on a hold for 25 minutes, only to hang up on you, forcing you to start over. Maybe you go to the local store, but the employees there say they can't help you and you just need to call that same service number you've tried before. You email, send a certified letter, contemplate flying to the corporate headquarters, but nothing seems to help. Each month, you just keep getting those bills with erroneous international calls. This actually happened to me once before, and I'm not going to share the name of the company, just know I'll never do business with them again. Maybe your experience was a little more daunting. Maybe the state notified you that part of your land was going to be taken from you under eminent domain to build a road or provide an easement for some utility, or, as has been the case in some places, to build a shopping mall. There never seems to be anyone who can help, and the way that it works, the angrier you get about it, the more unreasonable you look, enabling the theft of your property to be executed even easier without others even feeling sympathy for you. There's just nothing you can do about it sometimes. You just have to lay down and let the system steamroll you. Today, as we're watching our fellow countrymen in North Carolina struggle to recover from the apocalyptic flooding, I can't help but let my mind drift back to that story that caught my attention so many years ago. The story of some North Carolina farmers who had been so thoroughly steamrolled by an unholy union of private investors and local and state officials that they decided to push back. It's a story that, although microscopic in comparison to the larger American Revolution, absolutely contains elements that rhyme with that defining episode in American history. And it's a story that I'd be willing to bet that more than one of you has an ancestor who was involved. It's morning, on the 17th of May, 1771, just southwest of what is today Burlington, North Carolina, just south of Alamance Creek. 12 men sit in the shade of a tree, under guard of militiamen under the command of Colonial Governor William Tryon. As the men looked up the sloping, sparsely wooded field to their southwest, perhaps they wondered if they had made the right decision. The opening cast such a different scene than it had the day prior. The yelling, musket fire, the thunderous, bowel-shaking explosion of artillery. Now, only the sound of militiamen on work details, the occasional chirping bird, and probably as the morning wore on, the early sound of the annual cicadas. None of the men had likely been happy about the way things had played out up to that point, but they probably felt like some sort of resolution was near at hand, but probably not the resolution that they now faced. One of the men, James Few, brother of the future U.S. Senator and signer of the U.S. Constitution William Few of Georgia, likely didn't harbor any doubt about the decisions that he'd made. He held a burning resentment for Governor Tryon's local lackey, a man named Edmund Fanning. He was the man who symbolized everything that was wrong with North Carolina politics at the time. Tryon and Fanning were both there, not far from where the 12 men sat, waiting to find out what their futures held. Too close for comfort, no doubt. Few could feel his blood rising, watching Fanning occasionally glance their way, a satisfied look on his face. Some of the men may have still harbored a fleeting optimism that at least their current predicament offered them the opportunity to have their voices heard, a chance to stand in testimony to the injustices they had endured over the years. Maybe it was the darkness before the dawn. Few, however, was a man from a politically connected family. He likely understood how the game had played out and what the next steps were. Perhaps he could see some of those militiamen on work details tying one of their spare ropes for pulling the artillery into a noose. With no signs of gallows being constructed, he knew his time was coming soon. I wonder if his eyes scanned the tree line, wondering which tree would bear his body into the afterlife. Ultimately, Tryon, Fanning, and a number of militiamen approached those 12 men and called out Few's name. The remaining 11 prisoners were powerless to do anything other than to sit and watch, as he was escorted to a tall oak down along the creek. James Few was executed that day with no judge or jury, no trial or testimony, just a rope, a noose, and a tree. Of the 11 men who watched on in horror, 6 more would hang a month later at the gallows in Hillsborough. But what had they done that warranted such swift justice, if that's what it can even be called? That is what completely consumed me for the better part of a year. And it's the story that I want to tell you today. But the story doesn't start in May of 1771. No, it starts earlier. But the eternal question for history tellers is how much earlier? Part of me wants to take us all the way back to the 2nd century, where we see the competition between the Dalriada and the Picts of Northern Ireland and Scotland, around the time that the Romans were building Hadrian's Wall, but that would be a little overly indulgent. But there's a serious part of me that would like to start with the expansion of Christianity into Scotland and Ireland, and how Christianity influenced the Gaelic peoples, and in turn how the Gaels influenced Christianity, particularly some Protestant denominations. That's important, but there's just not time for that. We could start with the Radical Reformation in the 16th century and the formation of Presbyterianism, a particularly unique form of Protestantism, a sort of melding of some distinctly Scottish theology and ideas on church governance with the Calvinism that comes out of Geneva. Again, this is extremely important to understanding the farmers who stood up against their colonial government in 1771, but I think I can probably just hit the wave tops as we go through. I might start, though, in the mid-17th century with the founding of the Carolina colony, before the split between North and South. But don't worry, I'll try and be quick. So it's 1663, and King Charles II issued a charter for the lands that are today North and South Carolina, as well as Tennessee, to 8 English nobles collectively known as the Lords Proprietor. So Carolina gets its start, much like Pennsylvania, as a proprietary colony, in essence owned in private. But rather than being owned by a single family, it's divided up to 8. So imagine if Microsoft were a private corporation owned by 8 businessmen who didn't much like each other. Not exactly a recipe for success. As you might expect, the Carolina colony was pretty much a failure in the early years, with a notable exception of Charleston. The 8 lords couldn't settle on a single strategy for administering and governing the colony, so by 1729, 7 of the lords gave up and sold their interests back to the crown. That pesky 8th lord held on to his holdings, so while the colony was split into North and South, James Carteret, Earl Granville, held in private over a third of North Carolina. His lands consisted of the northern 60 miles of the colony running all the way from the coast to the mountains. As you might imagine, although Carteret gave up any control over the governing of the colony after he had switched to charters, owning that much of the colony put Granville in the unique political position of essentially being able to do whatever he wanted with his holdings. Now, to my knowledge, James Carteret never once visited any of his lands in North Carolina, and honestly, I don't think he ever set foot in the Americas. He administered his holdings in absentia, relying on land agents to handle his business for him. Granville gave these agents a long leash, and they spent a fair bit of their time trying to decide who they wanted to cheat worse, Earl Granville or the settlers who purchased land within Granville's district. In the end, they just clutched their money and laughed and cheated them both badly. The way that this cheating worked ran along two major lines of fraud. Along the borderlands between Granville's land and the Crown land, agents would visit families who had purchased Crown land and tell them that their surveyor had been mistaken and they were residing on proprietary land instead. It was, "Hey, so sorry you paid the Crown for this land. You'll have to take that up with them. As for now, you owe us for the land, or you better beat feet." Further within the Granville district, his agents would hit up families after they had been on the land for a few years and claim that they had failed to take one or two final steps in the overly complicated purchasing process, and thus their claim to their land was void, and they must either vacate the land or pay for it. All this allowed them to either bilk more money out of the settlers or evict them and then sell the land again. Of course, none of this was mentioned to Granville, so all of this additional money just lined the pockets of land agents and the local officials that they had to pay off to keep the fraud machine running. I suspect that this is at least in part responsible for the massive flow of Scots-Irish into South Carolina during this time. Although it wasn't all roses to the south, your biggest concern was dealing with Cherokee and Creek raiding parties, not being defrauded by your own countrymen. But here's the thing, really. They weren't their own countrymen. This is why I wanted to go back to the 2nd century, or at least back to the Reformation, because the people who lived in the Piedmont of North Carolina, or what we might more broadly call the backcountry, were Scots-Irish immigrants, relatively recently arrived. These people talked differently, they ate differently, worshipped differently, and had some pretty different beliefs about how the government should work. The land agents and the local officials, with a few notable exceptions, weren't Scots-Irish, but were proper Englishmen of good breeding. Tradition has it that Edmund Fanning descended from Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and perhaps that's why he was so hated in the backcountry. He was one of them who had chosen to be an aristocratic wig-wearer. You might think that this would probably have been a challenging caper to pull off, because eventually the Crown would have caught on to all of these farmers asking for refunds after the land agents told them that they had mistakenly bought proprietary land from the Crown. But here's the thing. The colonial leadership was more or less in on this whole thing as well. They weren't in it for the money, but rather, the way the power structure worked within the colony, the senior leadership was dependent on the local officials to keep their power. Here's how it worked. Although the royal governor ostensibly appointed local justices of the peace, he really just approved whatever names were given to him by the lower house of the colonial assembly. Justices of the peace back then had pretty similar functions to JPs today, but they were far more important back then. They wielded tremendous influence on who was appointed to positions like sheriff, clerk of deeds, and other local positions, which could oftentimes be quite lucrative. As you might imagine, the JPs didn't nominate men based on their credentials or capabilities, but based on their willingness to play the game the right way. Sheriffs, in particular, were powerful men who could build significant wealth even though their position was unpaid. They survived off of the fees that they charged for their services. Sheriffs would often demand these fees to be paid in specie, or actual hard money, instead of trade goods, which was a problem because there was very little money in circulation in all of the Carolinas, and certainly within the backcountry. Very rarely would farmers actually have the money needed to cover the fees from the sheriff and other local officials. Sheriffs would often let farmers maintain their debt with them for a while, and sometimes would have the farmer work the sheriff's property in exchange. But sheriffs would also seize the deeds of the farmer's land and put it up for auction to cover the debt. Only the auctions were rigged, and their buddies, usually Granville's land agents, would buy the land at a tiny fraction of its actual value. They would in turn sell it for an astronomical profit and give the sheriff and other members of the local bureaucracy a kickback for their assistance or silence in the fraud. But I was going to explain how the colonial representatives were involved in all of this as well. So, the members of the assembly depended on the local officials in order to get elected and re-elected. Voting didn't work in any way like we think of it today. There was no booth with a curtain, and it was done in open court in front of everyone, including all the local officials who had the power to make your life miserable. You would come forward when called, raise your right hand, and swear to your choice in the election. Everyone knew who the local officials wanted to win, and the expectation was that that's who you're going to vote for, unless you want trouble. So the whole power system was really all tied up neatly with a bow. Yes, the royal governor himself wasn't really part of this system, but most governors deferred to the assembly for all things that didn't directly involve crown interests. And the crown was royally disinterested in anything having to do with the rights of the people. So, although there were occasionally governors who took a more adversarial approach with the assembly, for the most part, local power was an impenetrable good old boy network with the highest of top cover. So for the land agents, local officials, assembly members, and local farmers, it was a case of win, 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 lose. Land agents resold properties time and time again, pocketing this off-the-books money. Local officials enabled this because they got kickbacks and would oftentimes buy these lands themselves at major discounts. And members of the assembly had a lock on votes by creating top cover for all of this. The farmers, however, were in a death spiral of debt and forfeiture that no one could see their way out of. But since they belonged to a people group who were already despised by those in power, who cared? This kind of grift continued without redress for a shockingly long time. In 1758, a number of farmers petitioned the colonial legislature to look into these dirty deals. Unsurprisingly, after the authorities looked into the problem, they determined that Granville's chief land agent, Francis Corbin, was squeaky clean. A couple of dozen farmers didn't see the humor in the assembly's findings and decided to take matters into their own hands. They rode all the way to Edenton in the far east of the colony and kidnapped Corbin and another land agent. The kidnappers dragged them all the way to Enfield, about 75 miles away. They put him and his subordinate agent through an extra-legal court hearing in which he was forced to open his record books and agree to refund farmers the money he'd swindled. All of this resulted in Corbin being relieved of his duties as land agent by Granville, who was embarrassed by the whole affair, and Royal Governor Arthur Dobbs was able to use this as a means to remove him from the Royal Council, as he never much liked him. A dirty swindler is never down and out for long, though, and before long, Corbin found himself a seat on the General Assembly and once again was in a position to cause great problems for everyone. As you might imagine, all of this trouble in the Granville district led many farmers to seek opportunities elsewhere. The easiest thing to do was simply move a bit further south and west, out of the Granville lands and into Mecklenburg County. The only problem with that plan was that while this was definitely Crown and not proprietary land, there were a number of men who had bought up large amounts of land from the Crown in hopes of making some money off of it. When your land plat maps are measured out in language like, from the white oak near the bend in the Rocky Creek, down southwesterly to a copse of pines along a gully, you can see that there's plenty of room for misunderstanding. One of these land speculators, Henry McCullough, decided that the influx of farmers from Granville District and the general ambiguity of land surveying presented an opportunity to make a buck or two. So he decided to pay his lands in Mecklenburg a visit and bring along some surveyors of his own. He'd go from farm to farm, informing the owners that they in fact owed him for portions of their farm and in some cases for the entire thing. In an especially slimy tactic, he also informed them that they owed him for the value of the property as it existed, meaning including all of the improvements made by the farmers themselves. So let's hold up here and just imagine for a bit. You've purchased some raw land on a wild frontier. Just surviving is a challenge, but you've managed to really make something of it. You've constructed a home for your family using nothing but your own two hands and the resources available on your land. You've cleared sections of your property and have turned what was once forest into rich farmland. Then, someone comes along and says that you owe him money not just for the land, but for the house that you built and for the fields that you plowed. I think you can understand, if not condone, what happened next. In what became somewhat hyperbolically known as the Sugar Creek War, one morning McCullough woke up to find that his lodging was surrounded by masked men with guns. No one said a word, but the message was clear. Although McCullough heeded the message, he did continue to send his surveyors out to press his claims. In May of 1765, local farmers caught McCullough's surveyors out without their security one day and beat them within an inch of their lives. One of the surveyors, and I quote, very nearly had daylight let into his skull. McCullough complained to the royal governor, but several of the leading men amongst the Mecklenburg farmers had beaten him to it and had written to the governor to tell him what McCullough was up to. The then governor, William Tryon, basically told him to ease up. See, not long after this, in November, the Stamp Act was set to commence, and there was already a fair bit of angst bubbling up, and Tryon didn't need to juggle multiple issues. He likely didn't care, but McCullough was making his job harder. Backing up a few months, in the summer of '65, a man named George Sims, stood out in his town square and gave a speech that started to light fires inside the disaffected farmers' hearts. Sims's address spoke to most of the major issues that later regulators would latch on to. George himself was historically unremarkable. He was born in Virginia and came with his family to the Nutbush area of modern-day Vance County. He worked as a schoolmaster, and other than the dust that he kicked up from this speech, we really don't know much about him. What is important was his articulation of the frustrations of the backcountry farmers in such a way that it artfully walked the line of open dissension. Sims was specifically addressing the abuses of a particular clerk of court named Samuel Benton, but if you removed names, he could have been speaking about almost anywhere in the backcountry. His address is fairly lengthy, and there was a number of good parts, but the best is a fictional story that he tells about a farmer in debt. The farmer runs on hard times and has to run a line of credit with a local merchant. He can't pay it back, so the merchant takes him to court. Well, the farmer is now indebted to the merchant, as well as to the clerk of court, who charges a fee for adding the case to the docket. He also ends up in debt to a lawyer he must hire for the simple act of pleading guilty to the debt, and to the sheriff for summoning everyone involved. So, the path out of indebtedness had the farmer working for the clerk, then the lawyer, and then the sheriff, since he didn't have the money to pay any of them. Of course, while doing all of this, he's not working on his own farm, so he ends up further in debt to other merchants. So he ends up having to sell his land to cover all of these debts. And lo and behold, who buys up his land? The clerk, the lawyer, or the sheriff. From a modern perspective, you might be thinking that Sims is some sort of proto-socialist trying to conjure up class-based angst, but he's really not. Sims has no issue with those in debt being forced to pay off the debt, and had no real issue with the officers of the court performing their functions and being paid for it. He was even fully bought into the whole heavily stratified Southern cultural hierarchy. His beef was that he felt that local officials were operating outside of the limits of their lawful purpose. The best line in the whole thing is, "I think, gentlemen, if there is no law to ascertain the clerk's fees, there is no law to compel us to pay any fees at all." There are a number of good one-liners throughout the address. I'll link to the full text of it in the episode description. Sims' words were picked up by a number of backcountry gentlemen, which is kind of the 18th century version of going viral. It might be a stretch to say that the Nutbush Address launched the regulator movement, but it made the rounds and got people thinking. Thinking can lead to sharing can lead to organizing, and organizing can lead to resistance. The organizing started with a man named Herman Husband, a religious zealot in Sandy Creek. He organized his neighbors into the Sandy Creek Association, forming a backcountry congress, and hoped for a peaceful resolution to their concerns. They called on a local office holder named Edmund Fanning to hear their complaints in hopes of having them addressed. Fanning replied through the clerk of court that by assuming the name Congress and having the audacity to summon him, they were already in a state of insurrection. The association replied that they never intended to assume power that they did not have, and even offered to meet with Fanning on his home turf in Hillsborough. Fanning dodged their efforts to meet with him and instead focused on mocking them and strengthening his own positions. It took some time to raise the required money, but in the summer of 1767, a number of associators attempted to have their concerns addressed in court, but they were rejected by the judges. Discontent spread, and the desire to achieve some sort of resolution led them to pursue less than legal measures like refusing to pay taxes at all. Through the remainder of 1767 into 1768, farmers throughout the backcountry seemed to be looking for any occasion to defy public officials, and those same officials looked for any occasion to cement their authority. Husband and a number of his followers traveled the backcountry meeting with other disaffected farmers and encouraging them to organize with each other under the name Regulators. Part of me wants to pause here and go on a tangent and talk about the historical use of this particular term, but I'll spare you. So by early to mid-1768, you have a resistance movement, rapidly growing and building in cohesiveness, at the same time that you have a power base realizing that its very authority is in question. People are taking sides, and a confrontation seems inevitable. While the regulators may have been comfortable with occasionally roughing up a few individuals here and there, they were reluctant to engage in large-scale violence until they had worked their way up the escalationary ladder. This was part of a long tradition in the British Isles. Before resorting to rebellion, you had to kind of check all the boxes on the way there. Many of the regulators started engaging in what we today might call lawfare or lawjitsu. They hoped to weaponize the courts against the local officials who were their primary focus of the angst. Their hopes were naive, though. The court officials and the local authorities were in cahoots, and in many cases were one and the same. So the regulator suits that made it to the docket were found in favor of their opponents. Few even made it that far. In turn, the local authorities started to push back, hoping that raising the stakes might cause some of the regulators to back off. The sheriffs started targeting well-known regulators, arresting them for whatever reasons they might cook up, although typically it was tax debts, an easy route since many regulators had sworn not to pay taxes until their concerns were addressed. On April 8th of 1768, the sheriff of Orange County seized a horse of a well-known regulator. As you might guess, the reason was for tax debt. I guess in 18th century North Carolina, you really shouldn't mess with a man's horse because this triggered a violent response from the regulators. They convened at Hillsborough and forcefully took the horse back. They also rioted, damaging local property, and they smacked around some of the local folks as well. This unrest spread into neighboring counties, and regulators began openly defying the local government, going so far as taking over the Anson County Courthouse and presiding over it themselves. This shocked the local elite, and in Orange County, Edmund Fanning responded by briefly locking up a few of the men that he felt were chiefly responsible for the rioting. Again, though, the regulators felt that there were still arrows in their quiver of nonviolence, so they decided to reach out to Governor Tryon. An interesting move, since Tryon had recently succeeded in levying a tax on them to fund the construction of his personal mansion. Tryon responded with language that sounded sympathetic, but it was really just kind of political rope-a-dope. In the long line of royal governors since their charter changed, Tryon and his predecessor Arthur Dobbs were somewhat sympathetic with the plight of backcountry farmers, but you have to remember, Tryon was seeing this within the context of the growing rebelliousness of the late 1760s. If he didn't deal forcefully with a group that was openly defiant of their local authorities, what would that mean in regards to his opposition of the Assembly's resistance to the Stamp Act? Determined to lead a peaceful opposition movement, the regulators returned to their futile attempts to test their cases in court. The Hillsborough Superior Court sessions of September 68 and March of 69 yielded nothing concrete for them and had a few cases found against them. While Edmund Fanning was found guilty of fee gouging, he was only fined 5 cents. The only other peaceful recourse that they had was to try to get some of their own into seats in the House. Surprisingly, in July of 1769 they got their chance. Governor Tryon had dissolved the legislature in response to their determination to take up the Massachusetts circular letter regarding the Townshend Acts. As a result, the regulators had a chance to participate in an election during the absolute height of their organization. And participate they did. A few regulators, Herman Husband among them, found themselves headed eastward to represent regulator concerns. But it was to no avail. Husband offered up a list of issues to address, and the eastern representatives in turn commenced an investigation of the election of the regulator representatives. Is this sounding familiar? Growing frustrated with political defeat after political defeat, many regulators decided it was time to play a different kind of politics, a harder form with more sticks. Things started going sideways in the September 1770 session of the Hillsborough Court. Shortly after the judge brought the court to session, a large body of regulators burst in and demanded that their cases be heard. But at this point, they weren't interested in tossing on some powdered wigs and discussing the finer points of local policy. They made their cases heard by grabbing Fanning by the collar and beating him senselessly. They nearly beat one of his eyes out, but in the commotion he was able to escape. They beat another lawyer severely as well, and dragged in the body of a long-dead slave and draped his remains over the lawyer's bar. A strange touch, to be sure. One particularly disgruntled regulator even, how do I put it, had a bowel movement in the judge's chair after the judge had adjourned the court and fled the scene. The regulators were furious that Fanning had managed to make a getaway, so they moved on to his residence and started smashing and destroying all of his most valuable belongings. Then, someone got the bright idea to just completely disassemble his whole house. So these dudes whipped out their hammers, axes, and crowbars and went to town. The riots in Hillsborough lasted for 2 days and solidified Tryon's decision to go hard with regards to the regulators. In a new session of the legislature, Herman Husband was ejected from the House and the Johnston Riot Act of 1771 was passed. The law was made retroactive to cover the riots in Hillsborough, effectively making the regulators outlaws. The farmers weren't amused by this development. They began organizing in unbelievably large numbers. In present-day Fayetteville, over 2,000 men formed up with the ideas of storming the government offices in New Bern. Naturally, this made Tryon nervous, and he was frantically cobbling together an army to march west and reinstate order in the backcountry. To be honest, though, Tryon had been deeply concerned with the militia for years. Several times in the years leading up to the Battle of Alamance, he had put out the call to muster in case the regulators decided to attack. To me, this is a window into how Tryon framed the whole issue. He was a professional army officer, so he likely looked at contentious political issues through the lens of a tactician examining the movements of an enemy. The old adage, "to a hammer everything looks like a nail," comes to mind. Either way, he really struggled to cobble together enough men to constitute a credible threat to the growing number of regulators gathering in encampments throughout the backcountry. What he did have came overwhelmingly from eastern counties. He was lucky enough to be able to secure some heavy metal, though. He acquired 2 pieces of field artillery and several carriage-mounted swivel guns. With the added firepower of the King of Battle, his relatively small force of just over 1,000 would be strong enough to oppose a much larger force of farmers. All of this was not without precedent, though. In the first disturbance in Hillsborough back in 1768, there had been a brief standoff between regulators and the militia. While I'm sure that tensions were high, it's unlikely that either side were really looking to get into an engagement. It was all part of this dance in which men were able to negotiate resolutions, but were able to save face by looking manly while doing so. That seems to be the mental model of most of the regulators as Tryon marched west into the backcountry, seeing this as sort of a same song, different verse kind of situation. On May 9th, 1771, Tryon's army was encamped just outside of Hillsborough with a plan to join up with the militia general Hugh Waddell's additional force that was located near Haw River. On the 12th, though, he received word that Waddell's force had been besieged near Salisbury and that his store of powder had been destroyed. At this point, Tryon switched to a different song. He was set for a fight. He ordered his men not to even change their clothes without orders. He kept 1/3 security on during the night and ordered his horses to remain saddled 24 hours a day. The next day, Tryon camped his force along the Great Alamance Creek, and his scouts informed him that a large body of regulators were also camped nearby. Almost immediately, the two sides started exchanging messages. The last message sent by the regulators expressed their seriousness. It said, "The interest of a whole province, the lives of His Majesty's subjects, are not to be trifled with." Tryon's response? The next day he sent a message which said, "Submit yourselves to the laws of your country, and then rest on the lenity and mercy of the government." The governor gave the regulators 1 hour to disperse and surrender up their leaders, or he would subdue them by force. 2 regulators, Robert Mateer and Robert Thompson, crossed the field between the two sides to try to de-escalate the situation. They offered a prisoner exchange. The regulators would return 2 of Tryon's officers that they'd nabbed, and Tryon would return 7 of the regulator prisoners. Tryon kept Thompson as a hostage and returned Mateer and another messenger to tell the regulators that their time was running out. A long time went by with no indication of surrender by the regulators. Frustrated and impatient, Governor Tryon pulled out a pistol, pointed it at Thompson, and blew his brains out. I'd like to think that Tryon immediately regretted his decision, though, because his next move was to send out his aide with a flag of truce to basically say, "My bad." Before the aide had made it even a few yards, the regulators' response came whizzing by in the form of a lead ball ripping the flag of truce from the aide's hand. Sporadic gunfire started, most likely from both sides. Tryon turned to his troops and commanded in a frantic tone, "Fire! Fire on them or fire on me!" From across the field, someone heard a regulator shout, "Fire and be damned." Like many small-scale battles in the 18th century, details on what followed are sparse. It seemed as if the colonial militia had trouble getting their artillery into action, allowing the regulators to score some early points. Once they figured out which end of the cannon to point at their enemies, though, the regulator numbers dwindled quickly. Few people seemed interested in standing against that kind of firepower. But a sizable force remained and commenced in what they called an Indian style of fighting. Attack and retreat, hiding behind rocks and trees, taunting Tryon's men throughout. At one point, a group of regulators seized an artillery piece, but with no ammunition for it, were forced to withdraw. By most accounts, the battle lasted between 1 and 2.5 hours. After some time, the regulators started running low on ammunition. Tryon ordered his men to set fire to the woods that the regulators had been using for cover, and really with nothing left to shoot and with their cover turning into an inferno, the regulators fled. Tryon attempted a brief pursuit before ordering a truce to bury the dead. The colonial forces spent the next few weeks moving about the backcountry, burning crops and homes, while administering loyalty oaths. Not long after, Tryon departed North Carolina for his new position as Royal Governor of New York. Edmund Fanning followed after him to be his assistant. But what of the regulators? Well, it's complicated. The frustrations that generated the movement continued. But as an organized movement, the regulation died at Alamance. Large numbers of backcountry farmers read the tea leaves and left the Piedmont for greener pastures, many to the west in the Watauga settlement. Much has been made about the connection between the regulation, the Battle of Alamance, and the later American Revolution. Some have gone as far as to say that Alamance was actually the first battle of the war. I think that's certainly hyperbole, but what connection is there? There's an awful lot to unpack, and I really can't do it here, but over the last decade or so, I've been working to identify the loyalties of the 850 or so names associated with regulator communications. Many historians have highlighted the mixed loyalties of both the leading men of the regulation as well as the leading men of Tryon's force. This might argue against a strong link between the events of the regulation and of the revolution, but I think that that's slamming the gavel a bit prematurely. So far, my research has painted a picture of a people either trending towards Whig association or away from association entirely. My gut instinct tells me that they were largely Whiggish in their ideology, but for many, the thought of putting aside old beefs to fight for independence alongside the men who had held them down under a corrupt regime was just too much. Fading into anonymity in the frontier was far more appealing for many. If you Google the Battle of Alamance and read the Wikipedia page, it hardly seems like something worthy of as much time and effort as I've put into studying the North Carolina regulation. But it really was just the cherry on top. When you peel apart the onion of motivations for the fight, there's so much more to understand that directly informs how we understand our own rights and responsibilities, and how we understand the role of nonviolent and even at times violent pushback. I have a lot of sympathy for the regulators. But once you spend enough time researching a subject like this, you realize that it's a little too complicated to call either side the good or bad guys. They were in a tough spot, and they did some pretty crappy stuff. But that's the thing about pushing people into a corner. That builds the prime conditions for people to make bad decisions and to start doing crappy stuff. I hope that this has been interesting or at the very least entertaining for you. It's certainly been a much longer episode than I usually go for, but once I get started on one of these topics, it's really hard for me to stop. I'll link to some additional resources if you want to learn more. If you even made it all the way through this episode, would you please drop me a line on Twitter at the WGTPod? You can also message me at podbean.com. Given that my normal thing is a 10 to 12 minute episode, I'm kind of curious as to how many of you are down for the occasional marathon. Either way, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.